Good morning and welcome to this message. We're continuing the series Back to School, looking at young people in the Bible who God used in powerful ways at various stages throughout history. I'd like to start by sharing you a bit about my education, my further education. In fact, when I came to Cardiff, it's actually 25 years ago this September that I arrived in Cardiff as a fresher to start my university course at Cardiff University. I travelled across with my mum from Sussex, where I grew up, and I remember that journey vividly, even though it was more than half my life ago now. I remember that journey down the M4, which seemed to go on forever. I remember the cake that my mum had made for me to share with my housemates to try and build a bit of a rapport and to develop a few friendships with my flatmates. I remember walking up the steps and walking into my halls of residence with my bags and meeting my friends, my housemates for the first time. I remember when my mum drove away and left me all alone. There I was at 18 years old, about to start university, thinking I was grown up, but looking back, I was still quite young. And wow, 25 years has flown by. And the reason I share that with you this morning about my arrival in Cardiff 25 years ago is we're looking at a young man in the Bible who's probably a similar age to the age I was when I started uni. He's called Daniel. And Daniel, when he was that sort of age, he too travelled to a far off and distant land, like I did when I came to Wales from the southeast of England. Daniel was forced, in fact, to travel to Babylon. He was taken in captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. He'd conquered Jerusalem and Judah had fallen, the tribe had fallen, and they were all being hauled off to captivity. And Daniel was amongst them with his friends. And they had travelled probably hundreds of miles to Babylon to start their new life, not knowing what awaited them, not knowing what the future looked like, feeling lost, feeling downhearted and discouraged perhaps at leaving their homeland. Daniel arrived in Babylon, and as we read in Daniel chapter 1, we'll see three pressures where Nebuchadnezzar tried to influence and tried to pressure Daniel and his friends to conform to the Babylonian way of thinking, to the Babylonian lifestyle, to the Babylonian kingdom. And I suggest, if you're not familiar with Daniel chapter 1, that you hit pause on this message right now and read the chapter, because it's quite a long chapter and it's not something I'm going to read on this message, but I'm going to pull out three observations where Daniel and his friends faced pressures to conform. And what Daniel and his friends did is they resolved not to conform. They took a courageous stand. They refused to compromise to the lifestyle and the way of life of this new kingdom. And they held on to their faith, their Jewish faith and their Jewish upbringing. And I think there's great lessons for us there today to make a stand, to stand for the right kingdom. You know, although we live in the world, we're called to be part of a different kingdom as God's people, as God's children. And we can learn from Daniel and his friends and the courageous stand that they took in Daniel chapter 1. So if you're not familiar with it, hit pause right now and read the chapter, and I'll see you in a moment. But for those of us who are familiar and who have read Daniel chapter 1 already, let's take a closer look at those three areas now. So remember, Daniel is in captivity, and there are three areas that I've observed where Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom tried to pressurize Daniel to conform. You see, what was going on here was Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian government and kingdom knew that if they could get hold of the influential, the talented, the young people from the conquered kingdom, if they could assimilate them into their lifestyle and into their kingdom, then it would not only make the Babylonian kingdom more advanced and more sophisticated and more dominant and more influential, but it would also ensure that the conquered kingdom would remain subject to them, because they'd essentially taken the best of the best from the higher echelons of their society and conform them to the Babylonian way. And so Daniel and his friends were amongst this group who were picked out for this. And what the first pressure to conform that I see that they were subject to was that there was the pressure of their way of thinking. In verse 4 of Daniel chapter 1, we read that they were the young men without any physical defect. They were handsome. They showed aptitude for every kind of learning. They were well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. And the chief of the court officials was ordered to teach these young men the language and literature of the Babylonians. You know, in teaching the language and literature of a culture, you understand the way of life and the way of thinking of that culture. You know, the way we think is important. The way we approach things with our thoughts is important. You know, some of us, our glass might be more half empty as a natural default setting. For some of us, our glass might be half full as a default setting. And that influences our outlook and our perspective on situations. You know, thinking about the power of the mind and the importance of how we think. As a football fan, I always admire and look at Sir Alex Ferguson as a tactician and as one of the best football managers that's ever lived. And he is famous for his mind games, how he used to make comments in the media and try and get inside the heads of his opposition, particularly in the run-up to important games, or particularly to try and ensure the referees ruled in his favour on certain decisions. He was a master tactician at it. He was an expert, and he was known for his mind games. And he knew that if he could get in the mind of his opponents and get them to think a certain way, then he had won half the battle to winning that game of football. He was an excellent tactician, and his mind games are renowned. Another example that I can think of with the importance of thinking and how our thinking leads us to be part of the culture is what I'm doing at the moment is I'm actually learning Welsh. And I'm in my early stages and I'm doing okay. I speak a little bit, tipping back. And I'm learning because my boy Ruben is going to Welsh school. And so we're learning together, we're going on a journey. And I'm discovering that the more I read the Welsh language, the more I learn, the more I read the language and literature of the Welsh, of Wales and of Welsh culture, the more I am thinking like that in my mind, the more I'm trying to understand the words and think about what they mean. And so as I read the language and literature, as I do my Welsh courses, as I do my homework, as I have conversation, I'm learning more and more, and I'm starting to think in a certain way. You know, our mind, we're pressured to think in certain ways, aren't we, in society? You know, but as God's followers, we're called to live and think a different way. We're called not to speak the language of this world, but to speak faith's language, to speak with hope and with faith about what God can do. You know, God can do all things. There is nothing impossible for him. A great example of how we can not conform to the language and literature of today's culture, but to think and to be immersed in God's kingdom, in God's way of thinking, is to speak faith's language. And Daniel's friends in chapter 3 of Daniel went on to have a challenging situation again, where they were forced to bow down to that image of Nebuchadnezzar, and if they didn't bow down to it, they would be thrown into the furnace. And in Daniel chapter 3, here's an example of speaking faith's language, of not allowing our thoughts to be conformed to the pattern of this world. And Daniel's friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said this in Daniel chapter 3. They resisted the pressure to bow down to this image, and they said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God who we serve is able to rescue us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up. You know, there's a great example there of speaking faith's language, of taking a courageous stand and saying, God is able to do this. I'm trusting you, God, in this situation. I'm refusing to conform. I'm refusing to think a certain way. I'm refusing to bow down to this idol. And God is able to save us, but even if he does not, we will not serve you. What Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were doing was that they were speaking the language of faith, saying God is able to do this. God is able to protect us and lead us through. But even if he doesn't, leaning on his sovereignty, handing things over to him, saying, even if this is our time to die, even if God does not save us from this situation, we will never serve this idol or your idol. We serve the true and living God. You know, God is looking for us to speak faith language in situations, to not be conformed by the language and literature of the age, but to speak faith language. Romans 12 verse 1 and 2 says, calls on us to offer our bodies in view of God's mercy, to offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is our spiritual act of worship. And it goes on to say, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. God doesn't want us to be conformed to the pattern of this world, to the thinking of this age. He wants us to be like Daniel and his friends and to resolve not to. The second observation I have, where Daniel and his friends were pressurized to conform, was their loyalty was challenged. As they went into Babylonian culture, as they were taken into captivity, not only were they taught the language and required to read about Babylonian culture to gain an understanding of their new world, but their names were changed. It says in verse 7 of Daniel chapter 1 that new names were given to Daniel and his friends. See, Daniel was given the name Belshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. And what was happening here was the Babylonians were trying to remove God's influence from their lives, because their names, their Hebrew names, from the land of Israel, where they'd grown up, where they'd worshipped, which was all they'd ever known, their names honoured God. Daniel's name means God is my judge. Hananiah's name talks about God being gracious. Mishael's name means who is like God, or God is incomparable. And Azariah's name talks about God being a helper. The Babylonians removed these names from usage, called them by different names actually which brought their gods, their false gods, their idols into their thinking. They tried to remove the godly influence from their lives. You know, names are really important, aren't they? You know, you have a name and it's been given to you by your parents or by people who have brought you up and cared for you and loved you. Your name means something. It was given to you for a reason. You know, I'm very conscious that my name, Tim or Timothy, means honouring God. And every time I hear my name, I carry that thought that my name means to honour God. And it's a challenge, a personal challenge for me to live my life in a way that honours God. And maybe you carry a similar name, a name with a similar meaning that influences the way you live. And that's what was happening here, was The Babylonians were trying to change the influence and bring in ungodly influences into their lives. You know, we are children of God, aren't we? As we put our faith in him, we become God's children. John chapter 1 verse 12 says, to all who receive Christ, to all who believe in him, he gives the right to become children of God. Children not born of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Through faith in Jesus, we have the right to become children of God. We are brought into God's family. We're given a new identity. We become sons and daughters instead of slaves to sin. And with our new identity, it's a reminder to us where we belong. And the Babylonians were trying to say to Daniel and his friends, you don't belong in Israel, you belong here. And this is your new world. And Daniel and his friends were facing a pressure. Their loyalties were being pressured and challenged. And that's a great lesson for us. Daniel and his friends took a courageous stand. All the way through the Bible, you know, we know Daniel as the name Daniel. We don't know him as Belshazzar. Daniel remained true, and his friends remained true to their faith, even though their loyalties were called into question. And the third and the final observation I've got on the challenges, the pressures that they faced to conform to society was in their lifestyle, through their diet. You know, they were required to eat from the king's table. They had a daily allowance of food from the king's table. You know, when I've been on holiday abroad, you know, part of going on holiday to different countries, the food and the culture. The food is a great part of the culture. You know, the Italians eat food in a certain way at a certain time. Diet is different in different parts of the world, and it says something about the land where you're visiting, about the country you're in. The diet and the food is an important part of the culture. And the Babylonians were trying to influence and change their loyalties and influence them by, you know, the lifestyle, really, because diet and living it speaks to me of our lifestyle. And as Christians, our lives, the way we live our lives matters. You know, we're pressured to conform. There's pressure in society today for us to live a certain way, for us to conform to certain ways of thinking, for us to live a certain way. But as children of God, we are called to stand out and be different. Our daily lives should be a statement of not conforming to certain ways of living, to certain habits and lifestyles, to destructive ways of doing things. Ephesians 5 talks about us being children of light. And it's a great chapter. It's a great list of examples of how we can live differently and of how we can live our lives in a way that speaks of Jesus and honours him. It says, be imitators of God and live a life of love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. And it goes on to say there mustn't be a hint of anything destructive, sexual immorality, impurity, greed, obscenity, foolish talk, coarse joking, which are all out of place. It says, don't be drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. And Paul writes and says, you're once darkness, but now you're children of light. Live as children of the light. Produce fruit that honours God and that glorifies him. Daniel and his friends faced three pressures to conform. They were pressured in their way of thinking. They were pressured with their loyalties, and their lifestyle came under question. And they were pressured to live a certain way. And it says in Daniel chapter 1 that Daniel resolved not to. He took a courageous stand, not knowing what the consequences would be. And I want you to notice this, that as Daniel resolved not to, God honoured him. You know, as God honours faith. And faith is living out what we believe. It's putting into practice what we stand for. It's going from theory to practice and to making it count with our decision making and with our lives. It says in verse 8 that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He kept his diet, his vegetarian diet, and ate food which wasn't a compromise to him. And as Daniel resolved not to eat the food which was being put in front of him, God used people in that Babylonian culture to honour Daniel and to ensure that Daniel was protected and could make a stand. And as you make a courageous stand in your life, living day by day, staying true to God, refusing to compromise, refusing to live a certain way, to think a certain way, remembering that as a child of God, our lives should honour him. As you live and put into practice those things, God will honour you. And not only that, God will bring people around you. You'll come into contact with people who God will use to help you honour him. You see, there was a guard, and Daniel said to him, please don't give me this food from the king's table. Let me eat this diet instead. And look at us after 10 days and see if you can notice a difference. Because Daniel wanted to stay honouring God. And this guard, God used him and showed favour. He showed favour to Daniel, and he was used by God to allow Daniel to make this stand. And as a consequence of Daniel putting his beliefs into practice of demonstrating faith, God honoured him and promoted him. And you see that God took Daniel and his friends and they entered the king's service, and they were more effective and more influential than the king's magicians and advisors. You see, although Daniel was in captivity, God had a plan for him and his friends, and God used them. As they honoured God, God honoured them. Through the book of Daniel, we see, I touched on it earlier, how Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, took a courageous stand with that fiery furnace. Daniel, further down the line, took a courageous stand with the challenge to cease praying, otherwise he'd end up in the lion's den. And Daniel refused to compromise again there. The book of Daniel is a book of no compromise in a foreign land. And I think as I see Daniel and his friends in chapter 1, as they made a decision from the outset, as they predetermined not to compromise in their lifestyle, in what they ate, in what they were called, in the way they thought, as they resolved not to be influenced by the pattern of the world that they were in, it became easier for them to take even more courageous stands further down the line. And I believe that as you take courageous stands today in the challenges that you face, as you continue to honour God, God will help you and use you, and it will be easier for you to make more courageous stands in the future. And so I pray that God will give you courage and resolve not to conform, but to honour him in all things. God bless you. Thanks for watching.